This is part one on the Road to the Civil War lecture, the events that led to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. So, just two objectives really for this lecture, and that's just to be able to recall the events that led to the outbreak of the Civil War, and then to explain the significance of some of those events, the reaction of citizens in the North and the South, and why these compromises or attempts to settle the issue of westward expansion and slavery, why they didn't work. So here's the question: why did political compromises over slavery fail to prevent the Civil War? We talked about in class. I'm going to recap here real quick. The Compromise of 1850. Congress tried to pass a series of laws in 1850 to try and solve the issue once again of slavery moving westward, and that has to do with the land the United States gained and or slash took from Mexico, depending on your interpretation of that war. But over here in the peach colored where it says Mexican Cession 1848, that's the new land that was acquired by the United States, as well as the Gadsden Purchase that we bought from Mexico a few years later. That kind of capped off the territorial acquisition of the United States. And so with that, originally over here in the white polka dot area, the United States thought it had put to rest the issue of slavery and the expansion of it. But with this new land, they did not know if they wanted to follow the same rules that the Missouri Compromise had set. According to the Missouri Compromise, anything north of the southern boundary of the state of Missouri was prohibited. Slavery would be prohibited there. And so technically a giant chunk of that land would be as well. Well, of course, slaveholders would like to see slavery expanded. And so this debate's going to start up once again in this new territory. And that was when the Compromise of 1850, and I'm just kind of rehashing this, but in this compromise, it was a set of 5 laws to try and please both the North and the South. Really, we focus on 4 here, not number 5 necessarily, but just to show you here. To please the North, 2 parts of the law were this. California would be admitted as a free state. And I talked to you in class about that. That's because there was already a bunch of free settlers there who didn't bring slaves as part of the gold rush. And so they were ready for statehood very quickly and did not want to be a slave state. So it became a free state. And that upset the South because it throws off the balance in the Senate now between the South and the North. And also, they decided that they wanted the slave trade banned in Washington, D.C., our capital, because they didn't feel it was very proper that a nation founded on the idea of liberty and justice and inalienable rights should have that slave trade going on in the capital. The South, though, got some things in return, except for California. The rest of the land would be in the Mexican Cession. Settlers in the new area would be able to vote on whether or not slavery would exist in the new states. And the biggest part of this was the new fugitive slave law that Southerners wanted because it allowed for slave owners to send slave catchers or government officials to capture runaway slaves. The individuals who were captured had no right to a trial. In fact, some free African Americans living in the North who had never been slaves were accused of being slaves and sent back to the South. And one of the biggest controversies here was that Northern citizens were required to assist these slave catchers in helping bring slaves back to the South, fugitive slaves. And so this was the reason why the compromise unraveled. It was unsuccessful. It was a very controversial part of the Fugitive Slave Act. The South hoped that it would prove once and for all to Northerners that Southerners had rights to slaves as property, but really the outcome was that it really emphasized to Northerners, many of them, that slavery was evil. And it brought more people to the abolitionist movement. And in fact, we talked about how many of them, Northerners, resisted the law openly, hiding fugitive slaves, sending them to Canada, busting them out of prisons, jails, those kinds of things. So it was actively resisted by Northerners and caused greater tension. This compromise was unsuccessful. During this time, just 2 years after, in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe, or 1853, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the daughter of an abolitionist, we've talked about this book before, wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was about an enslaved man who was terribly abused by his overseer on the plantation. It's a fictional story based on some of her experiences in Kentucky, but also on accounts from people who had been in the South. So it's a very negative portrayal of slavery from the view of an abolitionist. And so this, of course, sparks controversy in the states during this time as well over the issue of slavery. This was a very popular novel, so more people are in the North are brought into what slavery might have been like. And it brings more people to the abolitionist view of slavery, showing this nasty side of slavery and how it helped Northerners see it as a moral problem for the nation. So it brought something that may have been a little more hidden to the nation to the forefront through a popular novel that hundreds of thousands of people read. And of course, Southerners, well, they view it as pure propaganda in that she was dishonestly portraying what slavery was like in the South. And remember, we talked about how some slave owners tried to portray slavery as a positive good, something that was good for the slave, the owner, and as well as the nation. And so they saw this as misleading information portrayed to Northerners that was inaccurate and causing further disruption between the North and the South. This little book did that. In fact, Abraham Lincoln would meet Harriet Beecher Stowe when the Civil War was going on, and he would say to her, "So you're the little lady that caused this war," in reference to this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, our own state has its origins in the events leading up to the Civil War. So in the Louisiana Territory, there was still unsettled land. And many people wanted it developed, move there, farm. They found out that it was no longer a terrible place to move. It wasn't a desert, but that you could actually farm there. And so in 1854, just a year after Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel and just a little bit after the Compromise of 1850, Congress passes a new law with the help of this man, Stephen Douglas, who actually wanted a railroad built through it for his own personal gain, helped pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed for the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to be organized, and the settlers who moved there would vote on the issue of slavery using popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty, again, is that fancy word for saying that people get to vote on issues. In this case, it's slavery. So they're going to let the people who move there vote to decide whether these new states would be slave states or free states. And, the idea is that, democracy will rule, everything will work out fine. Not the case. This backfires on Congress again, just as the Compromise of 1850 did. So here's a map to show you this. Over there in the yellow is the Utah and New Mexico territory, which popular sovereignty would be allowed there as well. It's part of the Mexican cession. And the purple areas are the Nebraska and Kansas territory, where settlers are going to move and also vote on the issue of slavery. So keep in mind, Missouri is right next to Kansas, and Missouri is already established as a slave state. And that's going to have a big impact on the development of Kansas. So once again, North and the South divided on this issue of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Southerners obviously love it because they get to vote and potentially bring slavery to new land. Now, I don't like to overgeneralize, right? Not every Southerner supported this, but many did. Like we said, just because they weren't slave owners, non-slave owners did benefit from slavery by providing slave owners with food to feed their slaves, and the Southern economy was driven off of the plantation system. And Northerners, of course, not too happy in general. They felt that, essentially the Missouri Compromise, which had outlawed slavery in this land in 1820, has been reopened. Kind of felt betrayed that Congress would take that Missouri Compromise away and potentially allow slavery to spread even further west. So, in the Kansas Territory, after this law is passed, thousands of pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers come to Kansas, and they want to vote quickly on this issue of slavery in the territory. And what happens here in Kansas is that they vote quickly, and a lot of illegal voting goes on, actually. A lot of Missouri residents illegally come over and cast pro-slavery ballots for the state of Kansas. And what happens is that two governments are established that both say they're legitimate. One, a free state government, and one, a slave state government. And so we have two competing governments in Kansas in 1854 and 1855. Very quickly they develop. And they both say the other one is fraudulent or not legitimate. And so this is where fighting actually breaks out over this issue. So here is a good map of Kansas and some of the places where violence breaks out. You see the capital of the anti-slavery government in Topeka and the capital of the pro-slavery government in Lawrence. And two of the violence outbreaks that occurred in Kansas. There's many skirmishes that occurred, but I'm going to only talk about two, the big ones. So groups of pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers begin attacking voting stations, continue to vote illegally. People are killed. Roughly somewhere between 100 and 200 people are killed in this fight over Kansas as a free state or slave state. And it gets the name Bleeding Kansas from this. And two of those specific events I'm going to show you. One of them is called the Sack of Lawrence. And this occurred in 1856. And this was after the two competing governments had been developed. And Lawrence was a free state city. If you go to Lawrence today, you'll see the Free State Hotel. But that's the same Lawrence today. A group of 800 pro-slavery settlers came into the city and attacked it. They killed one man. They burned the Free State Hotel and destroyed the anti-slavery and free soil newspapers. So destroyed a significant portion of the town to strike fear in free state settlers. In retaliation, a man that will come up again, John Brown, committed a pretty violent act to pro-slavery settlers. This was what is known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, the bottom there of the map. John Brown, just 4 days after the attack on Lawrence, was an abolitionist. He's come to Kansas. He goes into Kansas. He takes 5 pro-slavery men from their homes at Pottawatomie Creek and, in front of their families, shoots them and hacks them to death with broadswords. Brutally murders them for this act. And this is very showing about how controversial the issue of slavery was in Kansas. And how tense the issue was at this time. And so technically some people would argue that the Civil War started in Kansas with these violent acts over whether Kansas would be a free state or a slave state.